Good morning. Gonna start with a story and then we'll go from there. So if story's not your jam, feel free to open up week 5 in Schoology and get started on that. All right. So today I want to tell you folks about an experience my great grandmother had. So I told you last week that I grew up on a farm since I was 4 and that I was surrounded by grandparents. Well, one of those grandparents really intrigued me. So my mother's grandmother, my great grandma Malfi, when I knew her, she was going blind. And she moved onto the farm with us so that, frankly, her daughter, my grandmother, could take care of her. I loved reading to her. That was one of my favorite things. But I also found that she was a great storyteller. One day, my grandmother decided to take me and my great grandmother to the store. And I noticed there was this older gentleman who, as soon as he saw, and by older, I mean about my grandparents' age, as soon as he saw my grandmother, he just changed his demeanor completely. He got himself all straightened up. He made sure his clothes were all right. And then he talked to my grandmother, which really puzzled me. Even though she was going blind at that point, she recognized this person and was asking him all these questions about his life. And then he left, and I was like, what was that? So my grandmother explained, I used to be a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse, and he was one of my students. And I was like, why was he so freaked out by seeing you? Like, Grandma, I don't know if you saw this, but he straightened his posture and his clothes before he walked up to you. And she just smiled and nodded. And keep in mind, she was just a teeny little thing, maybe 4 foot something, just teeny. And so I was like, he was kind of intimidated by you. And she smiled and went, that's how you do it when you teach. Except her parents were from Ireland. So she had a little bit of an Irish accent, which would especially come out if she was angry or when she was storytelling. So I kept asking her to tell me more and more about what it was like in a one room schoolhouse. What kind of job was that? So one of the things she told me is in a one-room schoolhouse, all the grades are represented. So she taught first through eighth grade. That's when school stopped back then. If you wanted to go on after that, you went to the county high school. So she had first through eighth grade. She said one of the secrets to doing this job was you give everyone a job, as she put it. She goes, everyone has a job, everyone's working. So as you can see in this picture here, there's a big old stove in the middle of the room. One of the duties of the teacher when they came in the morning was to get that stove going, also to clean the classroom, all those things. So my grandmother said if she had a student who needed some extra attention, she would have them be her stove assistant. And kids would fight over this job, like who got to put wood or coal into the stove, that kind of thing. She said, and this one surprised me because she was a very proper lady. I said, well, how did you deal with kids who acted out? Because kids always act out. That's the nature of kids. That's their job. And she shocked me by explaining it this way. She was like, well, the first day of school is like the first day of prison. You have to get your rep. You got to find the biggest, meanest kid and make an example of him. I guess she used to pull some of the bigger kids by their ear, and then she would literally kick them in the butt at the door. I couldn't imagine doing that with any of you. That's too much power for me. But she seemed to really enjoy it. She seemed to really enjoy helping people by being stern. She also said, you also have to remember what struggles you had when you were learning and then tell your students that. They need to see you as a human first. And I'm like, that's great. She also said, remember, every single student in there is somebody's baby. Even if they annoy you, even if that student doesn't like you, it doesn't matter. They're somebody's baby. You got to treat them right. So she was right about that as well, I think. Now, some rules to be broken. And back in the day of my grandmother's teaching in the one room schoolhouse, there were a lot of strict rules for teachers. And she told me how silly the contract was and some of the things she broke rules on. For example, one of the rules in the contract was teachers could not wear nail varnish. That's what they used to call nail polish. You couldn't wear it because it made you look fast, made you look like you weren't as prim and perhaps as proper as you should be when you're a teacher. My grandma broke that rule all the time. She said, I want to have pretty nails, and that's that. You also weren't allowed, if you were a teacher, to be out like downtown past the hours, between the hours of like 8 p.m. to early morning. So, in other words, you had to pretty much live like a nun if you could. My grandmother broke those rules. She really enjoyed socializing, so she broke that rule absolutely. So, I'll end with this. So, I heard all these stories growing up about the one room schoolhouse. And I didn't want to be a teacher when I was younger. It sounded awful. It sounded horrible. And my grandmother continued to encourage. She goes, "You'll find what you need to do. You'll find what you're meant to do when the time is right." And she was absolutely right about that. So that was the time my grandmother was a teacher in a one room schoolhouse, a gig I definitely could not do.